video, which I'm super excited about because today I'm going to be launching a new series here on my channel, which I'm going to be calling Books and Baking. And honestly, I am so excited about this because if you can't tell already from the multitude of bookish and food related videos on my channel, I am a huge fan of both books and baking. So I thought, what better way to try and combine those two things together than by starting a chatty style series where basically I'm just going to be doing a little bit of baking and mostly just talking to you about books, just like I would do in any other sit down video, only this time there'll be food as well, which just makes it even better in my opinion. So I'm super excited to be launching this one today, and hopefully this is going to be a regular thing because I do bake all the time and I do read all the time, so why not just bring those two things together into a beautiful marriage of books and baking. So for the first installment of this series, I thought what better way to kickstart books and baking than by trying to sort all of the characters from the Hunger Games series into the Hogwarts houses that I think they should end up in. Now obviously I am not the official sorting hat for Hogwarts, so I can't claim that these are definitely the perfect Hogwarts houses for these characters, but I will definitely do my best to pop them in houses that I think that they would match up to. And I just think this is such a fun thing to do. I don't know if it's just something I do or whether other people do this as well, but I basically spend a good deal of time trying to sort characters from my favourite books and films and TV shows into the Hogwarts houses I think they would end up in. I just think it is such a fun thing to do. So I thought the Hunger Games would be a perfect one to start with because I actually only read this series very, very recently. I don't know what was wrong with me, but for some reason I did not read these books when they first came out, and so I finally got around to it, and I'm so glad that I did because they were incredible and I loved them so much, and I'm now even more excited for the prequel to be released on the 19th of May, and so I thought this would be the perfect time to try and sort some of the characters into their Hogwarts houses. Now because this is a trilogy and there are so many characters in this series, I've just picked a selection of the main primary characters just because otherwise we'll be here all day, but I'm really, really excited to try and sort them into their houses. And whilst I do that, I'm also going to be baking. Obviously this is books and baking after all, and today I thought I would make some vegan chocolate chip cookies. Because let's be honest, who doesn't love cookies? Now before I get into the book talk, I thought I'll just quickly talk you through the recipe I'm going to be doing, so then while I'm talking about books I can just make the cookies as we go. So I have very loosely based my recipe around a recipe that was recently released by Pret, because they've been releasing lots of their recipes now that we're in lockdown and their cafes are not open, and so they released a recipe for just their regular chocolate chunk cookies, which are not vegan, so I have basically just loosely taken that recipe and then veganized it. So for this recipe what you'll need is just some self-raising flour, some vegan butter. I've actually added a little bit extra butter than they request on their recipe, just because their recipe does call for an egg, and I obviously am not using an egg because it's not vegan, and eggs do add a little bit of moisture and also a little bit of fat to any recipe that they're involved in, so I've just used a little bit more of the vegan butter in replacement of that. We've also got a mixture of some golden castor sugar and also some demerara sugar. They didn't actually specify that, but I just picked whatever sugar I had in the cupboard. And then of course it's chocolate chip cookies, so we've got some chocolate. I'm going to be using the Bourneville Giant Buttons because they are incredible. And then we also just need a little bit of syrup, so I'm going to be using some maple syrup, again just because I think it'll add a little bit of moisture, a little bit of sweetness, not that we need it because I've got a lot of sugar, but maple always makes recipes better in my opinion. Some salt, and then I may also end up adding some oat milk, just depending on whether it's looking a little bit dry or not. So with that being said, that is the recipe, so let's get started and I will start sorting the Hunger Games characters into their Hogwarts houses. So before I get started, I feel like it makes sense to sort of summarise the Hogwarts houses themselves, just so you can kind of get a bit of an understanding about what I'm choosing people to go in certain houses for. So of course we have Gryffindor, one of the more popular houses I guess, which is known for braveness, chivalry, being very daring and outgoing. Usually more confident people end up in that house. We obviously then have Slytherin, which is my own house, and Slytherins are known for being very resourceful, cunning, a little bit focused on power, and kind of willing to push other people aside for their own gain, I suppose. We then have the Ravenclaws, who are very much known for their intelligence, academia, for their wit, and they really, really value people's intelligence. And then finally we have Hufflepuffs, who are known for being very hardworking, loyal, dedicated, and sort of really focused on fair play. So those are the 4 houses, and I will say that of the 4 houses, I do think that Slytherin and Ravenclaw are the most similar, and I often think that there's just a slight difference in their motivation, but they are both like very clever, academia focused houses, and they are all focused on success. It's just that the methods that they use to achieve their success are slightly different from one another. And I do think that there's a lot of crossover, and I noticed that a lot with the Hunger Games characters, because I did find a lot of them seem to either fit into Ravenclaw or Slytherin. But without giving away any spoilers, let's get straight into telling you which houses I think the Hunger Games characters should be in. So starting with our leading lady, Katniss Everdeen, I did struggle long and hard over which house I thought Katniss could end up in, because she has so many of the traits that match up to a lot of the different houses. She's obviously extremely brave, as we see right from the beginning of the series, as she volunteers as tribute to try and save her sister, which also I guess falls into the loyalty that you see in Hufflepuffs, because she's got such a sense of like familial loyalty, which is obviously very clear from her actions. We then have definitely a sense of like intelligence because of the way that she conducts herself throughout the Hunger Games. But finally, the house I ended up settling on for Katniss was actually Slytherin, just because I feel like Slytherin did combine all of those traits very well for her. I feel like right from the beginning, before the Hunger Games even start and before the reaping has even taken place, we see her as a very, very resourceful character. However, she's not necessarily someone that comes across as very friendly. She's not focused on really having any social interaction, even with people in her own family. She's very much focused on like getting done what needs to be done, and she has to be very resourceful because she's had to take on this sort of role of taking care of the family. And so I do feel like she really uses that resourcefulness to get done what she needs to be sort of doing, and she's very selective over who she wants to spend time with. I also then think that throughout the games we see a definite sense of ambition growing in her, not necessarily in the sense that she is like, I guess, wanting to like push other people aside for her own glory, but there is a sense of ambition that comes from wanting to do the right thing and for wanting to, I guess, make her sacrifice of volunteering as tribute worthwhile. And so I feel like she's very ambitious in a way that is maybe a little bit more methodical than sometimes we see in Slytherins, but I do just think that ambition, that ability to manipulate situations in order to succeed, and also her resourcefulness definitely pop her in that category with Slytherins. Let me know what you think. Just because I feel like Katniss is probably one of the more difficult characters to place because of the fact that she is such an all-rounder and she has so many amazing traits that make it really difficult to decide which house she should end up in. But for me, I think Slytherin is the one that pops out the most. And then moving on to our leading man, Peter, I really feel like Peter is a definite Hufflepuff for quite a few reasons. Firstly, because I just feel like he's a little bit more of an understated character, and I don't mean that in like a negative way. I just feel like one thing with Hufflepuffs is that they can be really brilliant people and are really kind and generous and just like all-round nice guys, but without necessarily wanting the recognition for it. They're not like, say, a Gryffindor who want to be chivalrous with the goal of being recognised as being a very chivalrous or like brave person. Hufflepuffs are happy to do the work and to do things that maybe put themselves lower in the pegging in order to like help someone else, but without necessarily wanting that recognition for it. And I feel like that's something that we see in Peter's character, even so back far as like when Katniss is remembering him from when they were children and the ways in which he tried to help her, putting himself at risk of becoming sort of ostracised or getting in trouble with his parents, but in order to help her, and he didn't want the recognition for it. So I feel like in that sense, he's absolutely a Hufflepuff, and also just in the way that he behaves right throughout the Hunger Games, in the way that he tries to act surrounding Katniss, and just in general, I feel like he's very hardworking, very loyal. He's decided that he is going to try and help Katniss throughout the situation, and I just feel like he is a good person who's willing to work hard, not necessarily super overstated. He's not necessarily someone that is like wanting super loads of recognition, if that makes sense, but I feel like he works hard and it pays off. So Peter, definitely a Hufflepuff. Next up, seeing as we are speaking about leading men, I figured we might as well talk about Gale. And the thing is for me is that I feel like we don't necessarily see all that much of Gale in the first book, but what we do see is that he is basically like a male version of Katniss. He is very focused on his own family or the people he's chosen that he thinks should have his protection. And so it's not that he necessarily thinks of himself as being better than other people, but he definitely has that focus of his tribe, and he doesn't necessarily want to socialize outside of it because he has this particular focus. And so I feel like, again, we see the resourcefulness, the willingness to protect his family, going above and beyond to try and succeed in order to help them. And I just feel like it's that resourcefulness and that willingness to be crafty, to go against the rules that are set by the government in order to protect the people that are close to him and that he cares about, that definitely pop him, I'd say primarily in the Slytherin house, although of course with both him and Katniss there are definite traits of like Gryffindor because they are both extremely brave, but I just think in the way that we see them socialise, or rather not really socialise with anyone outside of their own chosen circle, they definitely sort of fall more into the Slytherin side, in my opinion. Chocolate chip time! Woo. So moving over to some of these smaller characters, let's have a look at Haymitch, who I feel like is a very, very interesting character, who at first just seems like this very brazen and bold character who doesn't really care about what anyone thinks of him and just acts in a way that's quite selfish. And then as the series develops, you get to see a much more complex side of him, where you start to learn about the ways in which he behaved and the people who he interacted with, his own experience with the Hunger Games, and the way that he sort of steps up to try and help mentor Katniss and Peter. And I personally feel like he ends up in Gryffindor, just because I feel like as we see him from the very beginning of the series, he is someone who's like described as basically an alcoholic, which obviously in and of itself isn't necessarily like something that points towards bravery, but I think as the series goes on we see him battling with his demons in order to try and help the greater good, and I feel like that is a definite display of bravery. And then when you pair that with the historical information we get about his own experience with the Hunger Games, I feel like he just becomes this much braver and more noble character, and I feel like it's a really interesting one to follow his arc, because the character that we see at the beginning, who's just kind of a bit of a joke and someone that no one wants to be around and that no one can take seriously, actually becomes this really admirable character, a mentor, and someone that's actually a really, really valuable sort of piece of the puzzle that makes up the Hunger Games series. And I just think the way that he tries to step aside from his own selfish desires in order to help other people just makes him a definite Gryffindor in my opinion. Next up, we have the character that kind of kicks it all off for us, the one that sort of is like the centre of the whole series, aside from Katniss, and that is of course Prim, her younger sister, the reason that Katniss ends up in the Hunger Games at all. And Prim is a character that doesn't really, again, kind of like Gale, get all that much focus in the first book in the series, but I feel like she's one that grows in Katniss's opinion throughout the series, because of course as readers we are seeing things mostly through Katniss's view, and I feel like at the beginning of the series Katniss just views Prim as this younger sister that is in need of protection, and she isn't necessarily an individual person in her own right, she is just someone that Katniss needs to focus her attention on. Whereas I feel like as the books develop, and particularly by the time we get to Mockingjay, Prim has become this much bolder, more independent and very, very brave character who is also extremely intelligent, particularly in the focus of being like involved in medicine and helping people throughout battles and things like that. And I just feel like when it came down to it, the two houses that I was drawn to for Prim were Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw, because I feel like as a Hufflepuff she was definitely loyal, she was focused on hard work, kind of like Peter, she was understated, she didn't necessarily want to be recognised for what she was doing, and of course as Katniss's younger sister she kind of blended into the background, and it wasn't necessarily a character that you spend a lot of time focusing on, but she was developing in the background, doing what she thought was right, but then obviously she was also developing so much knowledge, becoming her own person, and I feel like in those senses she felt more like a Ravenclaw. So it was a little bit of a struggle for me, and I think I ended up settling on Ravenclaw just because of how well she was able to teach herself, all the knowledge she gained, both from her mum and then further on through the series from other characters. I just feel like she was able to grow so much as a person, and I talked about this actually in my Hogwarts Houses book recommendations video, which I'll link down below, when I was discussing the choice to put the Little Women book as my Ravenclaw pick. And I think the thing that made me think about that was the fact that in Little Women we see education and knowledge and intelligence in both an academic and a personal sense, and I feel like that's something that we definitely see in Prim's character. She has this definite academic intelligence, and we see that develop a lot throughout the series, but we also see her grow as a person, like I said, from just being Katniss's younger sister who is in need of protection to her own very, very capable character in her own right. And I think we see so much intelligence and academic growth throughout her in the series, and I just think she definitely fits into Ravenclaw. Although if you think Hufflepuff, do let me know down below, or if you think something else entirely, because I'd love to know what you think. And while I think Katniss spends a lot of the beginning of the book focusing on the protection that she thinks Prim needs, I also think throughout the first book we also see her develop a very sisterly relationship with Rue, one of her fellow tributes. And I actually very similarly did think that Rue should be a Ravenclaw, but this one was a little bit of a clearer answer for me. Like I said, I really struggled with Prim whether it would be Hufflepuff or Ravenclaw, but for Rue I did think it was a lot more clear cut, and the reason for that is because she was a character who you would have expected to be taken out immediately throughout the games. I do think that she's someone who, she was so small, so weak, and she didn't seem like she necessarily had any chance of winning the games, which of course didn't necessarily transpire, but she managed to make it quite far through the games just using her wit, her intelligence, and her ability to manipulate a situation to put herself out of harm's way. Now, she was obviously even more enhanced as a character when her and Katniss were able to pair their two characteristics together, which is another reason why I think that Slytherin and Ravenclaw are so similar to one another, because once these two characters, the one who I've decided is a Slytherin and the other one who is a Ravenclaw, came together and were able to use their wit, their intelligence, along with resourcefulness and cunning, that just made like such a dream team. And I do think that Rue definitely brought in that sort of wit and intelligence and that more sort of set back, cautious intelligence, which is I think maybe the difference between Slytherins and Ravenclaws. I think Slytherins are more likely to sort of jump straight into something and act in an intelligent way or a resourceful way that's a little bit more flamboyant, whereas I feel like with Ravenclaws it's a little bit more measured. And I feel like when Katniss and Rue got together in that way, you saw this like major sort of growth of intelligence and also strength and courage and confidence in these two characters, because they knew that they had like the best of all of the things. So I definitely think that Rue is a Ravenclaw. So moving my attention away from the districts and now into the capital, the next character I've had a look at is Effie Trinket, who is kind of like, I don't really know what her title is. Is she like a chaperone? I think it is, basically, of the tributes from District 12. And I think we see her definitely as a Slytherin, because she is so focused on appearances, on success. She thinks herself above District 12 at the beginning of the series, and even when she starts to reduce her opinion a little bit and starts to sort of enjoy her connection with District 12, there is still a definite focus on appearance, and her ability to accept District 12 only really comes from the fact that District 12 becomes like a successful district in the eyes of the public. And so I feel like she's so focused on outward appearances and doesn't want to be associated with anything that she thinks is less than herself, and I feel like that just definitely makes her very, very Slytherin in my opinion. Next up we have Katniss's stylist, Cinna, the person who basically gets her ready for the start of the games, all of the different celebrations, as well as afterwards. And he is, in my opinion, a very, very interesting character, I think, to say the least, just because at first he's kind of like just very focused on appearances, because that is literally his job. He is a stylist. But I also feel like he becomes a much more complex character who I think definitely shows himself to be a Gryffindor. Cinna is obviously the character that starts the focus on fire throughout the Hunger Games series, which ends up being a very, very important recurring theme throughout the series, and also something that Katniss is sort of known to represent. And I feel like the fire, and obviously Gryffindor, the colour is red, I feel like in that way they're definitely connected, but also in the way that Cinna uses his skill as an artist, as a designer, as a stylist, in order order to make subtle, sort of, what's the word for it? Subtle. Subtle challenges to the regime of the government, to the capital and to Panem, even though he is kind of like a cog within that system, is very, very brave, because of course it's one thing for someone within the districts to rebel, and that's kind of something that the government have come to expect, but when it comes from within the capital, from within the inner workings of this entire system, it becomes even more dangerous and of course even more powerful. And so as someone who is very, very much connected with the Hunger Games, as one of the stylists, and is very much involved with the inner workings of that government, he is a very, very brave character for the ways in which he stands up against it and uses his subtle means of the way that he styles Katniss in order to sort of portray that on a mass scale. It's just so, so brave, and we see obviously him definitely making these grand statements, and it doesn't necessarily serve to benefit him because he's already in an ideal situation. He is someone who is in the capital, who has a brilliant job, who isn't struggling in the districts, who has no fear of being put into the Hunger Games, and so of course his willingness to make that statement through Katniss's clothes, to put himself out there as the person who made this stylistic decision in order to try and help and benefit the districts and to incite change, just makes him an even braver character, because of course it's brave to step up and try and change something that is affecting you negatively, but I think it's a whole new level of braveness when you are willing to put yourself to one side to do something that maybe ruins your own status but helps those people who are really in need. And I think we see that a lot with his character in a way that I think is so brave, and definitely like the best side of Gryffindor. And I'd love to say that I've saved best to last, but that is quite honestly not at all true. The final character that I'm going to be attempting to sort into a Hogwarts house is President Snow, who I'm very, very interested to learn more about in the prequel to this series, because I feel like maybe that might end up changing the decision I've made. But as has come up in a lot of the discussions I've had today, I think with President Snow, the decision between Slytherin, which seems like the most obvious choice, and Ravenclaw was quite tricky for me, because I did really feel like he obviously is very power focused. He's the president and is known to have killed many people in order to preserve his own power, very similarly to someone like Lord Voldemort in the Harry Potter series. However, he also built himself up and was one of the youngest leaders that Panem has seen, and of course we see a definite intelligence, a focus on how he can manipulate the districts and what he can do to keep his own level focus on what he thinks should be going on throughout the entirety of Panem. And of course he must be a very intelligent man to have maintained his power for such a long time, and so I do feel like he's definitely got some Ravenclaw traits, but I think this is where, once again, Ravenclaws and Slytherins fundamentally share the same traits and skills, I believe. I think they both have the very same like fundamental focus. However, I think the way that they manifest this focus is where they differ, and I think naturally I'd be a fool not to say that President Snow manifests himself as a Slytherin, because he does sort of have that primary focus on power, and he uses his intelligence in order to achieve and maintain power. And I think that's maybe where he differs from a Ravenclaw, because he doesn't want intelligence for the sake of being an intelligent individual. He wants intelligence as a means of achieving more and more power, more and more control, and making sure that he has that ultimate power and control over Panem. So I feel like he is definitely a Slytherin. It was a little bit difficult for me at first, but I feel like the more I thought about it, the more obvious it was. I just wasn't sure if I was being like too obvious with saying he was a Slytherin, and maybe there was more depth to him. And that's one reason I am super excited to actually like read the prequel, because that may give us a little bit more understanding about how he actually achieved his power, and maybe to what extent he used his intelligence, and in the various ways in which he did use his clear intelligence in order to get to and achieve power. And potentially that might change my mind, but I think as we see him in the Hunger Games trilogy, he has definitely utilized his intelligence and his sort of wit in order to use power and to gain more power. And so he was obviously resourceful. He used the resource of his intelligence in order to reach that powerful status. But I think, yeah, he definitely becomes a major Slytherin by the end of the series. So that is basically it for my sorting of all of the Hunger Games characters. I'm now just about to pop my cookies in the oven and I'm so excited. I'll of course show you them when they come out. Okay, so the cookies are out of the oven, which pretty much brings this episode of Books and Baking to an end. I also thought it'd be fun to just summarise all of my thoughts on sorting the Hunger Games characters into their Hogwarts houses, because I thought I'd just like wrap up how many of each we ended up with and just do some final thoughts, because why not? So we ended up with 4 Slytherins, 2 Ravenclaws, 2 Gryffindors and only 1 Hufflepuff. And I thought this kind of led me onto another interesting discussion, because clearly I just can't stop talking today. But basically, when it comes to anything which summarises people's personalities based on a particular label, I always think that there is absolutely room for change, development, and there's just a little bit of wiggle room regardless of what label you might put on someone, and also different circumstances allow for different traits to develop. And so I feel like particularly the one that I sort of refer to here is either when it comes to Hogwarts houses or star signs. I feel like although they summarize the primary traits of anyone, and you can sort of say, okay, yeah, maybe someone born in this year might have like slightly more of these traits, or someone who falls into this Hogwarts house has primarily shown these traits, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is all there is to a person. And I feel like you may have a Slytherin who also has definitely got Hufflepuff, Gryffindor and Ravenclaw traits. As I sort of said with some of the Hunger Games characters, I feel like they all definitely had traits of all of the houses, particularly people like Katniss showed themselves to be proficient in so many different skills, but then you just have to kind of select which skills you think are the most prominent. And that kind of also leads me on to the fact that the Hunger Games is a series which is focused on a dystopian universe, and it's all about power, about self-preservation and about winning, and the government in this situation pins people against each other in order to promote that style of life and that sort of mental state of being focused on only your own preservation. And so I feel like in that circumstance, characters who maybe in other situations would have developed other traits have been forced to focus on the resourcefulness, the cunningness and the pursuit of power, because that is the world in which they exist. And so I feel like something that really comes up whenever you're kind of trying to sort people into any particular group is that depending on what circumstances they find themselves in, they will develop certain skills, or certain skills will show themselves as stronger because that is just what the situation calls for. So of course, although hard work is definitely important in this circumstance, such as the traits that we would see with Hufflepuffs, other skills such as being focused on power, being resourceful and maybe being able to be a little bit more cunning in order to put yourself first are more important. And so of course we see people developing those traits, and that's why we maybe ended up with slightly less Hufflepuffs and a few more Slytherins. So I thought that was kind of an interesting way to summarize, because I do think that anyone could develop any of those traits, although some might come more naturally to certain people. They could also develop other ones, it just really is circumstantial. So that kind of brings my thoughts to an end. I'm also going to taste one of these cookies in a second because they look so good. But yeah, let me know in the comments below whether you agree with my sorting of the Hunger Games characters, because I would love to hear your thoughts. I just feel like sorting is something that can be very personal, and also can often be a reflection of the things that you recognise within yourself. And so obviously as someone who's a Slytherin, I probably have quite a lot of the Slytherin traits, certainly more so than I do of the other houses. And so I feel like maybe it's easier for me to recognise those qualities, and that's why I've ended up with a few more Slytherins as well. So I feel like sorting can go literally any way, and as long as you can justify it, you could literally say someone is anything, because it really just depends on what you recognise. So that's why I always think this is such a fun game, and I love to hear what other people think. So with that being said, let's have a cookie. Okay, I'll have a bit of a cookie because it's been broken. Pat on the back. I feel like regardless of everyone's opinions on the different Hogwarts houses, one thing we can all agree on is that chocolate chip cookies are always a good idea. So with that being said, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to leave me your thoughts in the comments down below, and I'll see you next time.